What? What, the witness?
Halloween night, 1974. Emergency room lights glare off white tile as doctors fight to save an 8-year-old boy who has suddenly begun vomiting and convulsing. Just hours earlier, he'd been out trick-or-treating with his dad. The candy looked ordinary. The terror did not. A decade later, on Texas death row, the man who gave him that candy stands in front of a microphone and says, "What is about to transpire in a few moments is wrong." The crowd outside chants just one phrase, trick or treat. Ronald Clark O'Bryan looked like a safe man to trust with children. He was a church-going optician from Deer Park, Texas, a father of 2, the kind of man who volunteered at his local congregation and led hymns on Sundays. Neighbors described him as soft-spoken and pleasant, a fixture at community events and school functions. Behind that carefully controlled image was a different reality. A man drowning in debt, on the verge of losing his car, his job, and his house. Financial records would later show he was more than $100,000 in debt, an enormous sum in 1974. In the months before Halloween 1974, O'Bryan quietly took out multiple life insurance policies on his young children. By the time October arrived, his son and daughter were worth more to him on paper than he could ever hope to earn in years of work. He had not grown up in the stereotype of chaos. Born in 1944, O'Bryan's early life does not feature the classic indicators of a future killer. No verified brutal abuse, no string of juvenile arrests, no childhood arson or animal cruelty on record. School records showed him to be an average student, neither exceptionally brilliant nor troubled. His problems appeared later. As a young adult, he struggled to keep steady employment, moving from job to job, failing to manage money, piling up debts he could not repay. By his early 30s, he was a husband and father with a collapsing financial life, behind on car payments, facing repossession, and being threatened with the loss of his home. Creditors called daily. His employer at Texas State Optical had warned him about his performance. Rather than cut back, ask for help, or declare bankruptcy, he sat down with an insurance agent. Over several months in 1973 and 1974, he layered policies on his children's lives, some without telling his wife, others downplaying the amounts. It was a quiet paper trail of intent. His crimes unfolded in a single night but were built on weeks of planning. On October 31st, 1974, O'Bryan took his 2 children and some neighborhood kids trick-or-treating in nearby Pasadena. Jim Bates, a neighbor, accompanied them, later providing crucial testimony. At one point, O'Bryan walked ahead, then reappeared holding several giant pixie sticks, claiming a mysterious neighbor had just dropped them into the kids' bags. Only he ever saw this supposed stranger. He described the man as living in a house with its porch light off, already suspicious since homes without lights are typically skipped by trick-or-treaters. Later that night, back at home, he encouraged his son Timothy to choose one last piece of candy before bed. Timothy picked the big, unusual pixie sticks. Inside the paper tube was not sugar, but a lethal dose of potassium cyanide. Within minutes, Timothy was vomiting and convulsing. He died on the way to the hospital at Southeast Memorial Hospital at 10:20 p.m. 4 other children had also been given the poisoned sticks. By sheer luck, parents confiscating candy, a child unable to open the stapled tube, none of them consumed more than a taste. The horror wasn't just that someone had poisoned Halloween, it was that the someone appeared to be the child's own father. In the first hours, O'Bryan played the role of devastated parent. He told police he could show them the house that handed out the candy, but could not remember the exact address. He went on television, talking about the dangers of tainted treats, but investigators quickly noticed that only O'Bryan's own son had eaten the pixie sticks. The supposed poison house did not exist in the way he described. When detectives started looking at his finances, suspicion hardened into something else. They discovered multiple life insurance policies on the children, some purchased just weeks before the murder. The total value on Timothy's life was $31,000. About $175,000 in today's money. They learned that On the morning after Timothy's death, before the funeral arrangements were even complete, O'Bryan had called his insurance agent to ask about collecting the payout. One agent later testified that O'Bryan called before the child was even in the ground. The breakthrough came when a chemical supply company employee recalled a man asking detailed questions about cyanide. Although he had not purchased it there, the interest stood out. The description matched O'Bryan. Investigators searched O'Bryan's home and found scissors with plastic residue consistent with the cut Pixie Sticks wrappers. They also discovered a knife with traces of sugar and plastic. The web of coincidence snapped. Within days, the man the community had pitied was in handcuffs, charged with capital murder and 4 counts of attempted murder. He pleaded not guilty. He kept insisting a nameless neighbor was to blame. The trial began in May 1975 at the Harris County Courthouse in Houston. Prosecutors framed O'Bryan as a calculating killer who weaponized a national fear to hide a targeted murder. Harris County District Attorney Carol Vance built a case on 3 pillars: the insurance motive, O'Bryan's suspicious behavior after the death, and the impossibility of his story about the mysterious neighbor. Medical experts testified about the cyanide, explaining how it had been added to the Pixie Sticks in a way that required careful planning. Insurance agents laid out the policy trail, showing how O'Bryan had systematically increased coverage on his children. Family and co-workers described his mounting debts and strange calm. After Timothy's death, the defense tried to paint the case as an overreaction to a tragedy, arguing that panic had turned a grieving father into a convenient suspect. They suggested someone might have targeted the O'Bryan family specifically. The jury did not accept it. After less than an hour of deliberation, they found him guilty on all counts and sentenced him to death by lethal injection. On March 31st, 1984, almost 10 years after his son's death, Ronald Clark O'Bryan was led into the execution chamber at the Huntsville unit in Texas. He had exhausted all appeals. His last meal consisted of a T-bone steak, French fries, Boston cream pie, and iced tea. In his final statement, he said, "I forgive all who have taken part in any way in my death. God bless you all, and may God's best blessings be always yours." He never admitted what he had done. Outside the prison, crowds gathered, some holding signs that read "Trick or Treat," as if the holiday itself had come to collect a debt. Others dressed as skeletons or carried candy. The man who had tried to turn his child into a check was finally out of moves. At 12:48 a.m., he was pronounced dead. Was this the story of a fundamentally evil man, or of an ordinary father who allowed financial panic to erode every moral boundary? The record shows no psychotic break, no documented mental illness, only a series of choices where his child's life became a solution to a spreadsheet. His case prompted Texas to pass new laws about tampering with consumer products. Long after his execution, parents still check their children's candy on Halloween, fearing strangers. The real lesson of Ronald O'Bryan is more disturbing. Sometimes the danger is not the stranger at the door, but the person holding your hand on the way there. As we leave a small Texas suburb, we move to Chicago's Gilded Age, where another man found a way to turn murder and insurance into a business model. The crowds at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago saw progress everywhere. Electric lights, new machines, towering buildings. Just a few miles away, a 3-story structure rose in the Englewood neighborhood, a strange angular building with windowless rooms and confusing hallways. Its owner introduced himself as Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, a physician and businessman. He offered lodging and employment to young women flocking to the city. He charmed creditors, romanced tenants, and jingled keys to a private empire. Years later, the world would know him by another name, Herman Webster Mudgett, better known as H.H. Holmes, a serial killer and insurance fraudster who made death his primary investment. To his neighbors, Holmes looked like a model of modern success. He was educated, soft-spoken, impeccably dressed. He ran a pharmacy, told stories about his medical training, and moved with ease through Chicago's booming middle class. His blue eyes and carefully trimmed mustache gave him an appearance of respectability that local newspapers would later contrast with his crimes. In reality, he was a con man with a long history of unpaid bills, fake identities, and shady deals. His crimes were not confined to murder. They included forging signatures, stealing property, and staging fake deaths to collect life insurance payouts. At least 9 murders can be credibly tied to him, and suspicion extends to many more. His own confessions varied wildly, at one point claiming 27 victims, at another more than 100. Most historians believe the true number lies somewhere between 9 and 30. His notoriety comes not only from the body count, but from the way he fused homicide and financial fraud into a single system. Mudgett was born in Gilmanton, New Hampshire in the early 1860s into a strict New England household where his father, Levi Horton Mudgett, was known for harsh discipline. Later tales of his childhood describe bullying and a morbid fascination with skeletons. Some historians believe these accounts are exaggerated or embellished, but his fascination with anatomy is well documented. As a medical student in Michigan, he learned not just dissection, but opportunity. There were rumors, backed by circumstantial evidence, that he used stolen cadavers to stage accidental deaths, collecting insurance money by claiming the bodies were policy holders. He may have first tested this scheme at the University of Michigan Medical School, where access to unclaimed bodies gave him the raw materials for fraud. Even if every story cannot be confirmed, his pattern is clear. He saw insurance not as a safety net, but as a target. His first verified frauds involved fake injuries for insurance claims, teaching him how easy it was to turn paperwork into profit. By the time he arrived in Chicago under the name H. Holmes, he had already honed his skills in fraud and reinvention. He bought a pharmacy, then the lot across the street, convincing bankers and suppliers to extend credit. On that lot, he built the infamous building later dubbed the Murder Castle by newspapers, a structure with hidden corridors, rooms that could be locked from the outside, and a basement equipped for dissection and disposal. The building at 601-603 West 63rd Street contained retail space on the ground floor and a maze of rooms above. Not every secret passage was built for murder. Some existed to hide stolen goods from creditors, but the environment gave him complete control over his tenants' movements and lives. Soundproofed rooms allowed him to isolate victims. Secret chutes made body disposal efficient. A kiln in the basement could reduce evidence to ash. When visitors disappeared, he simply told inquirers they had moved on to new opportunities. Holmes's crimes spanned roughly 1891 to 1894. His known victims included employees, romantic partners, and a business associate named Benjamin Pitezel. Many were women who came to Chicago seeking independence and found instead a predator with a doctor's manner and a con man's soul. Julia Connor, an employee who became his mistress, vanished with her daughter Pearl in 1891. Emmeline Segrande disappeared in 1892. Minnie and Anna Williams, sisters from Texas, also went missing after coming to Chicago at Holmes's invitation in 1893. Holmes used a variety of methods: asphyxiation in sealed rooms, possible gassing, and sometimes blunt force. When necessary, he reduced bodies to bones and sold skeletons to medical schools, turning victims into profitable medical specimens. Insurance policies threaded through his life. He persuaded associates and employees to take out life insurance coverage, naming him as beneficiary. Some never returned from trips with him. Others vanished after altering their wills in his favor. For Holmes, people were assets whose maximum value was unlocked at death. The Pitezel case shows his pattern with brutal clarity. In 1894, he and Pitezel devised a scheme to fake Pitezel's death in Philadelphia and collect on a $10,000 life insurance policy from the Fidelity Mutual Life Association. The plan, on paper, called for a substitute corpse. In practice, Holmes murdered Pitezel himself and then collected the payout using Pitezel's wife as an unwitting accomplice. He later took custody of 3 of the Pittercell children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard, under the guise of caring for them during the legal process. He moved them between hotels in cities across the Midwest and Northeast, writing letters to their mother that pretended they were fine. In reality, he killed all 3 children, strangling 2 and asphyxiating 1 in a trunk. When investigators found 9-year-old Howard's remains, they discovered the boy had been dissected in the same manner Holmes had learned in medical school. Behind every forged signature and fake name lay someone whose life could be turned into a claim. Holmes might have continued if the actuarial math had not finally pushed back. The insurance company grew suspicious of the Pittercell claim and hired investigators. When they looked closely, the unknown corpse used to support the policy turned out to be Pittercell himself, not a stranger. The discrepancy triggered deeper scrutiny. Pinkerton detectives, led by Frank Geyer, began tracking Holmes, who had already fled east. Detective Geyer's pursuit took him across multiple states, following a paper trail of hotel registrations and witnesses who remembered a man traveling with children. Holmes was arrested in Boston in November 1894 on an unrelated warrant for horse theft. As they peeled back the layers of his movements, purchases, and property records, investigators linked him not only to Pittercell's murder, but to the disappearances of multiple women and children. When they searched his Chicago building, they found blood-stained walls, hair in plaster, and human bones too small to belong to adults. Holmes went on trial in Philadelphia in October 1895, charged with the murder of Benjamin Pittercell. The courtroom posture of a cool, self-possessed professional could not hide the financial paper trail. Insurance documents, letters, and testimony from surviving associates painted a picture of a man who saw death as a financial tactic. Holmes initially maintained his innocence, but as evidence mounted, he began offering different versions of events. Newspapers later printed a confession attributed to him in which he reportedly said, "I was born with the devil in me. I could not help the fact that I was a murderer, no more than a poet can help the inspiration to sing." Whether that line is fully authentic or embellished, it captures how he wanted to be seen, as someone beyond ordinary morality, not as a greedy criminal who let money dictate murder. The jury found him guilty. He was sentenced to death. After the conviction, he offered multiple conflicting confessions, alternately claiming dozens of victims and then retracting his statements. On May 7, 1896, at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia, H. Holmes was hanged. According to contemporary accounts, his neck did not break immediately, and he died slowly, feet twitching for over 15 minutes as witnesses watched. He had requested that his coffin be filled with cement and buried deep, perhaps out of fear that his body would be stolen and dissected the way he had once handled others. In a final paranoid twist, he asked that his grave be topped with several feet of concrete to prevent exhumation. In the decades since, authors, filmmakers, and tour guides have embellished his story into legend, including Erik Larson's best-selling book, The Devil in the White City. What remains constant beneath the Gothic flourishes is that Holmes blurred the line between fraud and homicide until they became the same act. His case is one of the earliest documented examples of a serial killer who moved methodically from conventional insurance fraud to murder for policy schemes. Was he primarily a serial killer who used fraud as cover, or a financial predator who killed when his scams required it? The answer may be both. He operated in an era when fast-growing cities and weak oversight made it easy to hide a missing person behind forged paperwork. Identity verification was rudimentary. Bodies could be disposed of with minimal scrutiny. Death certificates required little evidence. His life is a warning that when systems value paperwork more than people, someone will eventually see murder as just another way to balance the books. When we leave Holmes's maze of corridors, we step into open prairie and oil fields, where life insurance and property rights would help justify a very different kind of killing campaign. The photograph looks ordinary at first. An Osage woman, dignified and composed, stares at the camera alongside her sisters, her mother, her extended family. What the picture does not show is the ticking clock. By the early 1920s, members of this family would begin to die, shot on lonely roads, blown up in their homes, found poisoned in their beds. When federal agents finally followed the money, they found the same name at the center of the web, a white cattleman called William King Hale, beneficiary of life insurance policies and heir to oil-rich head rights. In Osage County, Oklahoma, Hale cultivated an image of respectability. Originally from Texas, he had reinvented himself as a successful rancher, a benefactor to local institutions, a friend of the Osage whose land had made them extraordinarily wealthy through oil leases. By the 1920s, oil royalties had made the Osage Nation perhaps the richest group of people per capita in America. Hale gave gifts, attended funerals, and inserted himself as a helping hand into Osage family affairs. He was known as the King of the Osage Hills, a nickname that reflected both his influence and the community's misplaced trust. Privately, he treated those same families like assets to be stripped. At least several murders can be directly tied to his plotting, and many more suspicious deaths occurred in the same period. Estimates range from 24 to over 60 deaths connected to what became known as the Osage Reign of Terror. His name surfaces again and again in probate records, insurance policies, and inheritance transfers. Hale was born in 1874 in Hunt County, Texas, and came of age in a frontier culture where violence and land speculation were everyday currencies. There is no publicly documented child abuse to explain his later actions. What shaped him appears to have been opportunity and entitlement. As a young adult, he worked cattle, traded horses, and moved west into what became Oklahoma, gradually acquiring land and social influence. He built a ranch called the Big Hill Ranch near Fairfax, Oklahoma, where he entertained politicians and business leaders. By the time oil was discovered under Osage land and head rights turned tribal members into some of the wealthiest people per capita on earth, Hale had already built a persona as a reliable intermediary between white business interests and Osage families. The relationship was never equal. He understood the legal structures that controlled Osage wealth. They understood that men like Hale could make those structures work for or against them. As journalist David Grann documented in his book, Killers of the Flower Moon, Hale used that power imbalance to orchestrate a series of murders designed to transfer wealth away from its rightful Osage owners. The murders associated with Hale took place primarily between 1921 and 1923, during what Osage people remember as the Reign of Terror. Their victims included Anna Brown, found shot in the head in a ravine. In May 1921, her mother, Lizzie Q. Kyle, who died of suspected poisoning weeks later, her cousin, Henry Roan, shot in the head in his car in January 1923, and her sister, Rita Smith, who died alongside her husband, Bill Smith, when their home was bombed in March 1923. The connections between these deaths weren't immediately obvious to authorities, but they shared one commonality. Hale stood to gain financially from each. Henry Roan had taken out a $25,000 life insurance policy with Hale as beneficiary. That policy would prove crucial. In each case, death translated into money or control. When family members died, their head rights, legal shares in mineral wealth, consolidated into fewer hands, often those of white guardians or in-laws tied to Hale. In Roan's case, the benefit was more precise, a lump sum payout from an insurance company. Not only was Hale named as beneficiary, but he had also loaned Roan money using the insurance policy as collateral. The pattern was chillingly rational. Hale encouraged his nephew Ernest Burkhart to marry an Osage woman named Molly. Molly was the sister of Anna Brown and Rita Smith. Once married, Ernest stood to inherit from her family. Hale allegedly orchestrated the deaths of Molly's relatives by gunfire, by bombing, by poison, so that head rights and other assets flowed through Ernest to Hale himself. The conspiracy was extensive, involving local criminals like John Ramsey and hired killers. In Roan's case, testimony later indicated that Hale arranged for a hired killer to ambush him on a rural road, confident that the policy would pay out once Roan's death was certified. These were not impulsive acts. They were transactions carried out in blood. When the Smith house was bombed, it killed not just Rita and Bill Smith, but also a servant, Nettie Brookshire. This collateral damage shows how little the conspirators valued any life that stood between them and Osage wealth. For years, local authorities did little. The sheriff's office turned in cursory reports. Coroners accepted weak explanations. White jurors often showed little interest in pursuing cases where the victims were native and the suspects influential. Some local officials were likely complicit. It was only after the Osage Tribal Council formally appealed to the federal government that the Bureau of Investigation, precursor to the FBI, sent agents into Osage County. Tom White, a former Texas Ranger, led the investigation. Some went undercover as cowboys or oil workers. They listened in bars, followed rumors, and most importantly, followed the money. When they obtained Roan's insurance files, they saw a white rancher listed as beneficiary on a large policy. That name was already familiar from other suspicious cases. William K. Hale. That discovery was the pivot. Agents connected the dots between insurance policies, head rights, and the cluster of deaths tied to Hale and his extended family. They traced the movements of hired killers, documented financial transactions, and built a case showing how Hale had manipulated his nephew Ernest Burkhart into participating in the conspiracy. Under pressure, Ernest Burkhart began to talk. In court, he and other witnesses described Hale's role in arranging the murder of Henry Roan and the bombing that killed other members of Molly's family. Burkhart's testimony was particularly damning, as he described how Hale had instructed him to participate in the slow poisoning of his own wife Molly after her sisters had been killed. Hale was arrested and ultimately tried in federal court for Roan's murder, with the life insurance policy placed at the heart of the prosecution's theory. It was not a crime of passion, it was a planned killing designed to convert a man's life into a payout. In 1929, after multiple trials and appeals, Hale was convicted of murder in connection with Roan's death and sentenced to life in prison. The first trial had ended in a hung jury, but federal prosecutors, led by U.S. Attorney Roy St. Louis, persisted. At the second trial, a witness named Kelsey Morrison testified that Hale had paid him $500 to kill Roan. Reporters noted Hale's calm demeanor and his continued claims of innocence. He told journalists, "I am just as innocent as you are." He did not die in a cell. After serving around 20 years, he was paroled in 1947. He moved away from Osage County to Arizona, where he lived out his remaining years until his death in 1962. Ernest Burkhart was also convicted and sentenced to life, but was paroled in 1937, reconciled with Molly, who had survived the poisoning attempt, and lived until 1986. What makes Hale's case so disturbing is not only the cruelty of individual acts, but the way legal instruments, insurance policies, guardianships, wills, were turned into weapons. He operated within a system that already devalued Osage lives, using paperwork to make murder profitable and bureaucratic language to hide it. Federal agent Tom White later stated that the Osage murders represented the most complex, cold-blooded criminal conspiracies in American history. Martin Scorsese's 2023 film Killers of the Flower Moon brought renewed attention to the case, but many Americans remain unaware of this chapter in history. Was he an outlier, or the logical endpoint of a regime that saw Native people as obstacles to wealth? Even after his conviction, many Osage deaths were never fully investigated. The story forces a question: how many other accidents were in reality ledger entries? From a rural county in Oklahoma, we moved to a very different landscape, a series of marriages and funerals along the Gulf Coast where a woman's husband seemed to die just as paperwork says they're finally worth killing. Emma Smith Rain does not fit the cartoon image of a killer. Photographs show a middle-aged woman in church clothes, hair neatly pulled back, standing beside husbands who would not live to grow old. In 2006, her second husband, Ernest Smith, was gunned down outside their New Orleans home. Years later, prosecutors would argue that his murder was not a random street crime at all. It was the centerpiece of an $800,000 life insurance plot, part of a larger pattern of men around Emma dying, with policies pointing back to her. Publicly, Emma looked like a woman whom tragedy kept visiting. Her first husband, Leroy Evans, died in 1994 of an apparent illness, though questions would later arise about the circumstances. Her second husband, Ernest Smith, was shot to death in the driveway of their home in Gretna, Louisiana in 2006. A later partner, James Rain, would also die under suspicious circumstances, shot multiple times in 2016 in Mississippi's Pearl River County. Privately, investigators saw something else, a woman who moved from relationship to relationship, each one insured, each one ending in a way that raised questions. Ernest's case became the one they could prove. On paper, he was a hard-working man with a valuable policy, naming his wife as beneficiary. In reality, prosecutors said he was worth more to her dead. Orleans Parish Assistant District Attorney Laura Rodrigue would later tell jurors, "She's been paid to kill. She is a professional. She was a professional at having her husbands murdered." Emma's early life is not heavily documented in public sources. She appears in records as Emma Smith in Louisiana, living an ordinary working-class life in communities around New Orleans. What is clear is the pattern that emerges in adulthood. She marries, a husband dies, she remarries. Another husband dies violently. She becomes involved with James Rain, then with his adopted brother, Alfred Everett. Money is tight. Insurance once again becomes a factor. By the time Ernest Smith is killed in 2006, Emma has already lived through more spousal deaths than most people could bear. Her apparent resilience, which once looked like strength, began to seem suspicious to investigators. Court records show that she had taken out multiple policies on Ernest, increasing the coverage in the months before his death. On the night Ernest was shot, he was ambushed outside his home and killed at close range with a .22 caliber weapon. Initially, it looked like a street murder in a city already struggling with violence after Hurricane Katrina. But detectives noticed the insurance policy, $800,000 with Emma as beneficiary, and wrote to the insurance investigator that the widow could not be ruled out. What first appeared to be a random killing showed signs of planning. No forced entry, no theft, just a targeted assassination. Over the next several years, investigators in Louisiana and Mississippi quietly revisited other deaths connected to Emma. They found a pattern of insurance policies, convenient deaths, and Emma at the center. Meanwhile, Alfred Everett, James Rain's adopted brother, came under suspicion. Cell phone records placed him near the crime scene. In 2014, he was convicted of Ernest's murder. Testimony and jailhouse statements suggested he had been hired to kill and that Emma and James had promised him a share of the insurance money. That testimony was the break New Orleans prosecutors needed. In 2013, Emma was arrested and charged with second-degree murder in Ernest's death. Her case took 3 years to reach trial due to multiple delays and a complex web of evidence spanning different jurisdictions. At trial in 2016, the state laid out a narrative of greed and manipulation, arguing that Emma and James conspired to have Ernest killed for the policy. Prosecutors showed how she had methodically increased coverage and pushed for larger payouts. They presented phone records showing suspicious communications and testimony from witnesses who placed her in planning meetings with Everett. The defense countered that James and Everett had plotted without her, that she was being scapegoated for her lover's crimes. They questioned the reliability of jailhouse informants and suggested she had no knowledge of the murder plot. Jurors heard about her 3 husbands, her insurance benefits, and the strange repetition of widowed status. They deliberated for only a few hours before finding her guilty. Sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, Emma Smith Rain continues to deny she arranged Ernest's death. "I'm innocent," she told the court at sentencing. "God knows I'm innocent." Her case is currently on appeal. The other husband's deaths remain legally unresolved, though publicly debated. James Rain's 2016 murder in Mississippi is still under investigation, with some authorities suggesting Emma may have been involved, even though she was already incarcerated. Her story highlights how domestic spaces, marriage vows, and beneficiary forms can create a perfect cover for murder. When a person you trust most also stands to gain the most from your death, what safeguards really exist? As we leave her case, we cross continents to a South African township and a police officer who turned funeral policies into a personal killing strategy.
I accordingly imposed the following sentence on accused. The accused.
When South African officer Nomia Rosemary Ndlovu put on her uniform, she represented law and order. For nearly a decade, she patrolled the streets, responded to calls, and collected a government salary. Off duty, she was doing something else entirely. Between 2012 and 2018, 6 people close to her, 5 relatives and a boyfriend, died violent deaths. Each had been insured under multiple life or funeral policies, with Ndlovu as beneficiary. By the time she was caught, she had allegedly collected the equivalent of tens of thousands of dollars. To neighbors, Ndlovu could appear generous, even helpful. She came from a rural area in Mpumalanga and had made it into the South African Police Service, joining the Tembisa police station northeast of Johannesburg in 2007. But she also had a gambling habit and debt. Public records show that she quietly took out overlapping policies on family members: a cousin, witness Madala Homu, her sister, Audrey Ndlovu, nieces and nephews, her boyfriend, Maurice Mabasa. Some policies were small funeral plans, others were more substantial life insurance contracts with companies like Old Mutual, Clientele, and Liberty Life. After each death, she dutifully filed claims, appearing at funerals as a grieving relative, then collecting the money. Court records would later show she had taken out 36 policies on various family members for a total of 1.4 million rand, approximately $80,000. The killings followed a grim pattern. Family members died in staged robberies, mysterious illnesses, or unexplained roadside attacks. Her cousin, Witness Homu, was found beaten to death on March 1, 2012. Her sister Audrey was found poisoned and strangled in her home in June 2013. Her nephew, Brilliant Mashigo, was found murdered in January 2018. Her niece, Zanele Mofa, died from injuries just 2 days after Ndlovu had taken out policies on her life. Her boyfriend, Maurice Mabasa, was found stabbed more than 80 times near Olifantsfontein in October 2015. Relatives who trusted her invitation to visit or travel with her would be found dead soon after. For years, the deaths were treated as separate tragedies. It took a planned 7th killing to expose the design. In 2018, Ndlovu arranged a meeting with what she thought were hitmen, asking them to burn her sister Joyce and Joyce's 5 children alive in their home. "I want them burned," she was recorded saying. "I don't want any evidence." The hitmen were undercover police. They recorded Ndlovu outlining how the murders should be staged and what she would pay, 80,000 rand, about 4,700, for the entire family. She provided details about Joyce's house and the children's schedules, stressing that no one should survive. That recording, combined with insurance records and the suspicious sequence of deaths, allowed prosecutors to reframe the preceding years as a single, chilling campaign. A police officer turning her own blood relatives into policy payouts. In 2021, the High Court in Johannesburg found her guilty of 6 counts of murder, attempted murder of her mother, and multiple counts of fraud and incitement. During the trial, Ndlovu maintained her innocence, offering improbable explanations for her presence at crime scenes and her financial interest in the deaths. Prosecutor Rihanna Williams presented evidence showing how Ndlovu's gambling debt drove her to see family members as financial assets. The judge described her as cold and calculating, noting that she had abused both her family's trust and her position as an officer. Judge Romarumo Monama stated during sentencing, "You're a serial killer. You killed for greed." She received 6 concurrent life sentences plus additional years for the financial crimes. As of 2025, she remains imprisoned in South Africa, her appeal options narrowing. Her story became the subject of a documentary series, Rosemary and Lovu Kill a Cop. And Lovu's case forces a hard question. What happens when the person who is supposed to protect you is also betting on your death? Funeral insurance is meant to ease the burden of burial costs in poorer communities. She turned it into a blueprint for serial murder. The ease with which she obtained these policies for multiple family members through multiple companies without raising red flags exposed weaknesses in the insurance system. As Karabo Mokoena, the sister of one victim, told journalists, she didn't just betray her family, she betrayed the entire community that trusted her as a police officer. From South Africa, we travel back in time to early 20th century England to a man who turned bathtubs and life insurance forms into the final chapter of multiple marriages. In Edwardian England, George Joseph Smith played the role of the attentive husband. He walked new brides down the aisle, signed papers, and carried them over thresholds into rented houses with small, oddly chosen bathtubs. Within months, sometimes weeks, those same wives would be found dead in those tubs. Coroners often called it an accident. Smith called it bad luck. Insurance companies called it something else, a pattern. Smith was born in 1872 in London and spent his youth drifting through petty crime. Court records show he was first imprisoned at age 9 for stealing a shirt. His early years included convictions for theft, fraud, and receiving stolen goods, cycling in and out of prisons like wormwood scrubs. By his 20s and 30s, he had moved into a more profitable line of work, marrying women under false names, persuading them to sign over savings and properties, and then disappearing. Sometimes calling himself Henry Williams or John Lloyd, he targeted women with small inheritances or life savings. For a time, fraud was enough. But in 1912, 1913, and 1914, 3 wives, Bessie Mundy, Alice Burnham, and Margaret Lofty, drowned in their baths shortly after making wills or insurance arrangements in their husband's favor. Each death came with a payout or inheritance. In Mundy's case, the sum was 2,500 thalers, a substantial amount for the era. For Burnham and Lofty, the payouts were from life insurance policies Smith had insisted they purchase. His methods were deceptively simple. He married under different aliases, moved the couple into lodgings with an unusually small bathtub, and took out a life insurance policy or encouraged the new bride to adjust her will. Then, when the time was right, he ran water, helped her into the bath, and used a sudden, forceful motion to plunge her under. Medical experts would later theorize he grabbed their feet and pulled upward, forcing their heads underwater and triggering a vagal inhibition, a sudden disruption of heart rhythm that can cause unconsciousness. There were no bruises, no obvious signs of a struggle, just a healthy woman found drowned in a tub. On paper, it looked like a tragic accident. On the policy ledger, it looked like profit. Smith would be discovered with the body, appearing distraught, telling landlords and doctors how his wife had complained of feeling unwell before her bath. In each case, local authorities initially accepted his account. What finally stopped Smith was not a sudden confession, but an insurance query. After Margaret Lofty's death in Highgate in December 1914, the Yorkshire Insurance Company questioned the circumstances and alerted authorities. Around the same time, a detective named Arthur Neal read about Lofty's death and noticed similarities to the Burnham case from the previous year. Investigators began to compare notes with other towns. They realized that the widower in Highgate was the same man who had lost wives in Blackpool and Herne Bay, each under similar conditions, each with financial benefit. The coincidences broke. Neal's breakthrough triggered one of Britain's first major murder investigations to use forensic science. Pathologist Bernard Spilsbury reconstructed the crime scenes, demonstrating how the small, narrow bathtubs made involuntary drowning more likely. In 1915, Smith was tried at the Old Bailey for the murder of Bessie Mundy, with the deaths of the other 2 brides introduced as similar fact evidence. The case marked a legal milestone, as it was one of the first to allow evidence of pattern and system into a murder trial. In one of the most memorable courtroom moments, a female swimmer demonstrated how a person could be drowned in a small tub without obvious marks, supporting the prosecution's theory. Smith's defense, that 3 separate wives had all suffered identical accidents, strained credulity. The jury took just 22 minutes to find him guilty. He was sentenced to death on July 30th, 1915. When asked if he had anything to say, Smith replied, "I am innocent." Smith was convicted and hanged at Maidstone Prison on August 13th, 1915. As he walked to the gallows, he maintained his innocence, telling the executioner, "I am innocent. My life is being sworn away." His crimes became known as the Brides in the Bath murders, the subject of books, documentaries, and a BBC drama. His story is less about a monstrous impulse to kill and more about a ruthless willingness to turn marriage into an insurance scam with a body count. How many other accidental drownings then and now hide a calculation about payouts? From cold water in English bathtubs, we move east, to a bar in rural Japan where sham marriages and aconite poison turned customers into policies. Shigeru Yagi's bar in Honjo, Saitama Prefecture looked like any other small hostess club. Men came to drink, flirt, and feel important for a few hours. Yagi poured drinks and made introductions, but behind the scenes, he was engineering something else. Marriages between his hostesses and older customers, then life insurance policies on those men, and finally, their deaths by poison. Born around 1950, Yagi came of age during Japan's post-war boom and collapse. By the 1990s, the economic bubble had burst. Debts piled up. Bars and clubs struggled. Yagi, already involved in money lending and nightlife, saw a different path to money, one that combined insurance fraud with homicide. He operated from his modest establishment in Honjo, a small city about 60 miles north of Tokyo, where he had cultivated relationships with local businessmen and salarymen. He persuaded hostesses to enter into sham marriages with customers. Once married, the couple took out large life insurance policies on the husband, with the wife, and effectively Yagi, as beneficiary. He instructed the women on how to appear as legitimate spouses during the application process, even coaching them on personal details about their husbands. Between 1995 and 1999, at least 2 men died, and another survived in what became known as the Honjo insurance murder case. The victims were Noboru Baba, a 49-year-old company employee who died in 1995, and Tadao Matsushita, a 43-year-old who died in 1996. The method was consistent. The victims were given alcohol laced with aconite, a powerful poison derived from monkshood plants that Yagi grew specifically for this purpose. He often combined it with cold medicine to mask symptoms. One man was found dead after vomiting. Another apparently drowned after suddenly falling ill while fishing. His body discovered in shallow water where drowning would have been difficult in normal circumstances. Paperwork described natural causes. Insurance companies saw claims for large payouts filed by new wives connected to Yagi's club. The total fraud amounted to more than 200 million yen, approximately $1.8 million. The scheme unraveled when a third target, Fujimi Kawamura, sensed something was wrong after suddenly becoming violently ill. He had been invited to go fishing with Yagi, a seemingly friendly outing that mirrored the circumstances of Matsushita's death. When he began experiencing symptoms similar to heart failure, he recognized the danger and sought help. He alerted hospital staff and police. Investigators halted a planned cremation of another victim and ordered forensic tests. Autopsies revealed aconite poisoning, identifiable by its distinctive effects on cardiac tissue. Insurance files showed large policies taken out shortly before the deaths. Under questioning, 3 hostesses, Sachiko Kawaguchi, Hiroko Kazama, and Noriko Watanabe, admitted their role and pointed to Yagi as the orchestrator. In 2002, a Japanese court convicted Yagi of 2 murders and 1 attempted murder for the sake of insurance payouts and sentenced him to death. The trial revealed how Yagi had created an assembly line of fraud and murder. Find a suitable victim, arrange a marriage, secure a policy, administer poison, collect the money. Prosecutors described him as coldly calculating, noting that he had kept detailed records of policies and payouts. His appeals failed. The Supreme Court upheld the sentence in 2008. As of 2025, he remains on death row in Tokyo, where the average wait between sentencing and execution exceeds 10 years. His accomplices received long prison terms and were ordered to repay hundreds of millions of yen in fraudulent insurance and benefits. Kawaguchi, who had been directly involved in Baba's death, received a 22-year sentence. Yagi's case underlines a particular kind of coldness, not the frenzy of a spontaneous killer, but the careful construction of relationships whose only purpose is to end under a claim form. He turned intimacy into a weapon and life insurance into his primary revenue stream. Japanese criminologists noted that his crimes reflected a particularly calculated approach to murder, treating it as a business operation with cost-benefit analyses. He saw people as walking insurance policies, prosecutor Masahiro Tsuchiya stated during the trial. From here, we move to more recent crimes closer to home, cases in which partners and children were targeted for six-figure policies, and a single trigger pull was supposed to turn grief into cash. In October 2018, 56-year-old chef Dominic Sarkar was shot to death in his bed in Fremont, California. Sarkar had built a respected career in the Bay Area restaurant scene, working as executive chef at upscale establishments like Passage to India in Mountain View. He was a father, a colleague, and the quiet center of many people's lives. Born in India, he had immigrated to the United States to pursue culinary opportunities, sending money home to support his family. He was also, unbeknownst to him, the subject of a large life insurance policy. The beneficiary was his girlfriend, Maria Moore. Investigators say she decided that the fastest way to turn that policy into money was murder. Moore's public image was unremarkable. A woman in a relationship with a hard-working chef living in the same community. At 50, she presented herself as a real estate agent and healthcare professional. Privately, financial pressures and a long-standing connection to a man named Marvel Salvant would change everything. Fremont police records show that months before the shooting, Moore obtained life insurance coverage on Sarkar totaling around $800,000, naming herself as beneficiary. She had taken out the policy without Sarkar's knowledge, forging his signature on documents. Around the same time, she reconnected with Salvant, a former roommate and on-and-off partner who had a history of criminal behavior. On the night of October 8, 2018, neighbors heard nothing unusual. There were no signs of forced entry when police arrived at Sarkar's home on Robin Hood Drive. Sarkar lay dead from multiple gunshot wounds, apparently attacked as he slept. The scene suggested a targeted killing, not a random burglary gone wrong. Fremont detectives began working backwards. They found surveillance footage of a masked figure approaching the house on a bicycle shortly before the murder. Phone records placed Salvant in California at the time of the murder, despite his living in another state. Financial records showed Moore had wired money to him before and after the killing. Text messages revealed their planning, including discussions about how to make the death appear like a robbery. The pieces clicked into place: an insured man, a beneficiary girlfriend, a gunman with a prior relationship to her, and travel timed to the murder. Detective Michael Gebhardt, who led the investigation, called it a classic murder for insurance case, noting how digital evidence had created a clear trail. In 2022, a California jury convicted both Moore and Salvant of first-degree murder with special circumstances, finding that they conspired to kill Sarkar for financial gain and lay in wait to do it. During the trial, prosecutors Jessica Rohn and Elgin Lowe presented evidence showing how Moore had researched insurance policies, made the initial payment, and then waited for the policy to become active before arranging the killing. They were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole at the SOLV. Alameda County Superior Court. The detective who led the case later called the plot evil, emphasizing that the victim had trusted the very person who arranged his death. Dominic Sarkar was a loving father who had no idea that the woman he trusted was plotting his murder. Gebhardt told reporters after the sentencing. Sarkar's daughters, who traveled from India for the trial, described their father as a generous man who had worked hard to create opportunities for his family. What makes this case stand out is its simplicity. There was no long serial pattern, no complicated financial network, just one man's life, one large policy, and two people willing to trade his heartbeat for a check. From that bedroom in Fremont, we moved to a quiet house in Western Australia, where a son wrapped himself in the language of cryptocurrency success while secretly betting his mother's life against a cluster of insurance policies. By 2020, social media made it easy to build an image. Andre Zachary Rebello presented himself online as a cryptocurrency trader, the partner of an influencer, someone living a life of luxury. His Instagram account showed designer clothes, expensive restaurants, and all the trappings of financial success. Behind the filtered photos and designer brands, his financial reality was starkly different. Court records in Western Australia later showed mounting debts and no legitimate income. His cryptocurrency ventures had failed, leaving him with significant losses. To keep the image alive, prosecutors said, Rebello devised a plan: take out multiple life insurance policies on his mother, Colleen, forge documents, and then kill her. Colleen Rebello was found dead in her home in Bicton, a riverside suburb of Perth, in May 2020. She was 58 years old, a mother of three who worked in administration. Initially, her death was treated as non-suspicious. There were no obvious injuries, and early assumptions leaned toward natural causes. What no one knew then was that, in the weeks leading up to her death, her son had taken out 3 life insurance policies on her life, worth around 1.15 million Australian dollars, naming himself as beneficiary. Bank records would later show that Andre had accessed his mother's accounts to make the initial policy payments, using her identity to complete the applications online. The scheme depended on paperwork as much as violence. After Colleen's death, Rebello submitted claims to the insurers, attaching documents that would later turn out to be forged. A falsified coroner's report, fabricated medical records, a fake will. Staff at the insurance companies noticed discrepancies. The language and formatting on the documents were wrong. Dates did not line up. Medical details contradicted actual records. Instead of issuing payments, they flagged the claims as suspicious and contacted authorities. One company's fraud investigator, Sarah Mitchell, would later testify that the forged documents contained terminology no Australian medical examiner would use. Police reopened the case. A deeper examination of the circumstances around Colleen's death, coupled with digital records placing Rebello at her home that morning, transformed a presumed natural death into a homicide investigation. Detectives found that Andre had researched methods of undetectable killing online, focusing on techniques that might appear natural. Forensic evidence suggested asphyxiation. In 2022, he was arrested and charged with murder and 4 counts of fraud. At trial, prosecutors argued that his motive was simple greed, dressed in the clothes of a get-rich-quick trading persona. They presented a financial timeline showing his mounting debts, failed business ventures, and the timing of the insurance applications. In December 2023, a jury found him guilty. In April 2025, a judge sentenced him to life in prison with a minimum of 25 years before parole eligibility, calling the crime monstrous and noting that it involved the ultimate betrayal of trust. Rebello maintains his innocence and is pursuing appeals, but the evidence of policies, forged documents, and financial collapse paints a different story. His case reveals a modern twist on an old theme, not just killing for insurance, but using corporate and digital systems, online forms, scanned PDFs, electronic signatures as part of the weapon. The digital trail he left became central to his conviction. From Western Australia, we sail back in time nearly 2.5 centuries to the Atlantic Ocean, where a British slave ship's owners used marine insurance to turn mass murder into a business decision. The ship was called the Zong. In late 1781, it sailed from the west coast of Africa with more than 400 enslaved Africans packed into its hold, bound for Jamaica. The voyage was badly mismanaged from the start. The captain, Luke Collingwood, had no experience commanding slave ships. Navigation errors took the ship off course. Water ran low. Disease spread among the captives, who were chained below deck in horrific conditions. Faced with the deadly situation, the crew and owners made a choice that still shocks the conscience. They began throwing living men, women, and children overboard, not for discipline, not in panic, but as a strategy to claim insurance money for lost cargo. Under English law at the time, enslaved Africans were treated as property, not as human beings with rights. The Zong's owners, led by Liverpool merchant William Gregson and his business partner Gilbert, had taken out a marine insurance policy with underwriters that covered their cargo against certain losses at sea. If captives died of disease or starvation while on board, the owners would bear the loss, but if they were jettisoned to save the ship, treated as a kind of sacrificial cargo, the owners could claim compensation under the legal principle of general average, which allowed for some cargo to be sacrificed to save the rest. Over several days in November and December 1781, the crew forced more than 130 people into the ocean. Shackled or sick, their voices erased by the waves. Contemporary accounts from crew members later placed the number as high as 142. First Officer James Kelsall would later testify that captives were selected in groups, with the sick and weakest going first, followed by women and children. When the Zong eventually reached Jamaica, the owners did not face murder charges. They filed an insurance claim in London, arguing that the killings had been a necessary act to preserve the ship and remaining cargo. The insurers refused to pay in full, arguing that the jettisoning was unnecessary. Evidence showed that rain had fallen shortly after the first killings, replenishing water supplies, yet the murders continued. A lawsuit followed, Gregson versus Gilbert. In 1783, the case reached the English courts. The central question, as framed on paper, was not whether mass murder had occurred, but whether the insurers were liable for the value of the enslaved people who had been thrown overboard. Chief Justice Lord Mansfield, who presided over the case, treated it purely as a matter of contract law, noting that the case of the slaves was the same as if horses had been thrown overboard. The first hearing went in favor of the owners, treating the case as a matter of marine insurance law. A later appeal raised more pointed questions about necessity and navigation error. In the meantime, an abolitionist named Granville Sharp learned of the case and was horrified. He pushed for murder charges against the crew and owners, arguing that the deliberate killing of enslaved people, regardless of their legal status as property, constituted homicide. He publicized the facts, framing the jettisoning not as loss of cargo, but as murder. Sharp wrote, "The catastrophe of their making a property of the lives of men began to recoil upon their own heads." The courts never held a criminal trial for homicide. No captain or owner was executed or imprisoned for the killings. But the Zong massacre became a rallying point for the growing movement against the transatlantic slave trade, illustrating in the starkest terms how the commodification of human life enabled atrocity. In museums and history books today, the Zong stands as perhaps the clearest historical example of killing explicitly for insurance money. A mass atrocity carried out so that the owners could turn human beings into a compensable loss. Every element of the crime flowed through the logic of policy and profit. The case was immortalized in J.M.W. Turner's painting, The Slave Ship, and in numerous books and films. It forces an uncomfortable truth to the surface. Insurance, at its darkest extreme, can incentivize killing on an industrial scale. The same financial instrument designed to protect against unexpected loss became the motivation for mass murder. Was the Zong massacre the act of uniquely evil individuals, or the logical product of a system that turned human lives into insurable assets? The answer, again, is both. Individual decisions matter, so do structures that make those decisions profitable. The case illustrates how economic systems can make atrocity not just possible, but rational within their own twisted logic. Historian James Wolven wrote that the Zong case revealed the moral bankruptcy at the heart of slavery, showing how financial instruments could transform even mass killing into a business transaction. From a ship on the Atlantic to a modern suburb, from boardrooms to bedrooms, the cases you've just seen share a single through line. When someone stands to gain more from your death than from your life, you are in danger, whether you know it or not. In all of these stories, the methods change, the tools are different, the calculations are not. Each killer, each conspirator, each captain and syndicate looked at a living person and saw a number attached to their death. The moral and psychological takeaway is not simply that some people are monsters. In many of these cases, there is no clear history of psychosis or extreme mental illness. What we see instead are ordinary human traits: greed, entitlement, desperation, allowed to run to their furthest, coldest conclusions. The existence of insurance did not create these killers, but it gave them a precise way to quantify what their victims were worth, and to turn murder into a financial instrument. If you found this exploration into these shocking cases compelling, please hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Which of these killers do you think was the most disturbing? Share your thoughts in the comments below.